Chairman Powell, thank you for being here. Thank you to you and your team for helping to save the economy during the pandemic meltdown. For what it's worth, I'm generally supportive of the actions of the Fed right now, and I'm not going to ask you today to blame anybody. When Congress spends money, it stimulates the economy, does it not?
Well, it would depend on whether that's funded by tax increases or not. But so, if there's a spending that's not accompanied by taxes, would have a net at the margin stimulative effect.
Well, and when Congress borrows money to spend even more, that stimulates the economy even more, does it not?
At the margin, yeah.
Okay. If Congress reduced the rate of growth in its spending and reduced the rate of growth in its debt accumulation, it would make your job easier in reducing inflation, would it not?
I don't think fiscal policy right now is a big factor driving inflation at this moment, but it's absolutely essential that we do slow the pace of growth, particularly for the areas of the budget.
All right, let's try to unpack this then. I'm not trying to trick you. You're raising interest rates. You're raising interest rates to slow the economy, are you not?
Yes, to cool the economy off.
And one of the ways you measure your success, other than fluctuation in gross domestic product, is the unemployment rate. Is it not?
Yes, one of the measures.
Okay. So in effect, I'm not being critical. When you're slowing the economy, you're trying to put people out of work. That's your job, is it not?
Not really. We're trying to restore price stability.
No, you're trying to raise
not wages.
You're trying to raise the unemployment rate.
There are a lot of
I know you don't like the phrase, so let me strike it. You're trying to raise the unemployment rate, are you not?
No, we're not trying to raise it. We're trying to realign supply and demand, which could happen through a bunch of channels, like, for example, just job openings.
All right, let me put it another way, okay? The Economist did a wonderful study. They looked at 10 disinflationary periods in America going all the way back to the 1950s. Disinflation is what you're trying to do. It's a slowing in the rate of inflation. Am I right?
Yes.
In other words, prices don't go down, they just don't go up as fast. Deflation is when prices actually go down. You're trying to achieve disinflation, are you not?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Based on history, in the 10 times that we got inflation down, disinflation since the 1950s, in order to reduce inflation by 2%, unemployment had to go up 3.6%. Now, that's history, is it not?
I don't have the numbers in front of me, but yes, the standard has been that there have been recessions and downturns when the Fed has tried to reduce inflation.
Now, right now, the current inflation rate is 6.4%, and the current unemployment rate is 3.4%. Now, if history is right, I'm not asking you to again, blame anybody, but if history is right, unless you get some help, in order to get inflation down from 6.4% to, let's say, 4.4%, and the unemployment rate is going to have to rise to 7% based on history.
That's what the record would say.
Okay. And to get inflation down to 2.2% based on history, an immutable fact, unemployment would have to go to 10.6%. Would it not?
No, I wouldn't.
That's what the record shows. That's what the history shows.
Yeah, I don't think that kind of a number is at all in play here.
I know you're reluctant to admit it, and you don't want to get in the middle of a policy dispute. But I think it's undeniable. It's undeniable that the only way we're going to get this sticky inflation down is to attack it on the monetary side, which you're doing, and on the fiscal side, which means Congress has got to reduce the rate of growth of spending and reduce the rate of growth of debt accumulation. Now, I get that you don't want to get in the middle of that fight. But the more we help on the fiscal side, the fewer people you're going to have to put out of work. Isn't that a fact?
Please answer.
Could work out that way.
Okay.
Sir?
It could work out that way.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. Senator Reed of Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
And we'll have the staff, the finance staff, share what we have on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 with my colleagues. Senator Blackburn is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being with us today. I want to return to the SVB issue and ask you, I haven't heard you say today, when were you first notified that there were problems with SVB, and when did you alert members of Congress? What was that time lag?
I believe that I first found out about the troubles at Silicon Valley Bank. I guess it was last Thursday.
Last Thursday. And then your notification of Congress came when?
The bank was put
Why
in.
don't you just put that in writing for me so I don't waste my time? I know Senator Langford asked you about the Deposit Insurance Fund and how that would affect our local banks. And there's a lot of concern over this. And I know you were uncertain about that. If you would run the numbers on that and let us know a ballpark of what you think this would cost if you end up insuring everybody's deposit. And then I have to ask you, being from Tennessee, you know, we have a long and storied history of opposing nationalizing the banking system. Do you see this as a step to nationalize the banking system?
Absolutely not. I see
Okay.
this as a step toward stemming contagion that could come
Okay.
from the failure of these banks that would place community banks
Okay.
across the country at
Thank
great
you.
risk of runs as
All
well
right.
that we want to.
Thank you, ma'am. Let me move to the Inflation Reduction Act and that implementation. I hear a lot about this from local mayors and our state agencies. There is a lot of money that can be doled out. Treasury and other agencies are going to be required to issue guidance. That hasn't come, and so there's a lot of confusion there. And I was looking at the structure, and I want to make certain that I'm viewing this right. You have the Deputy Secretary, the Office of IRA Implementation within Treasury, the Office of IRA Implementation in the IRS, and Danny Werfel, who is the new, recently confirmed IRS Commissioner. So with all of these bodies involved, who is actually in charge? Who's the final decision maker on the guidance and the timeline for releasing that guidance?
Well, our Office of Tax Policy drafts regulations,
so they're
and we
doing
go
it?
through a regular rulemaking.
Then do you sign off on it? Are you the final say?
I
So
do
you
sign
are the
off
one
on it.
that's
We
the final
confer
say.
with many,
Okay.
many people in the
Then-
process of drafting that, and it will go through full comment and review before
All right.
final.
Let me ask you something else, because the buck stops with you. You have really praised the IRA. I want to ask you one more thing about that, because your statements contradict themselves somewhat. You talk about the IRA as a way to really bring prosperity, to lower inflation, to lower the debt. So do you really believe that we can spend our way to lower inflation, to debt reduction, and to economic prosperity with
Well,
the
I
amount of debt?
I believe that this law promotes clean energy and R&D and investment in the United States.
That's not my question.
that
Do
will-
you believe we can spend our way to lower inflation? And I'm going to move on, obviously.
I've never said
we
any
don't there.
such.
Oh, well, okay.
I've never said that I think that
All
that's
right.
a
Thank
way
you,
to
ma'am.
lower inflation.
You have mentioned the IRS being able to answer more phone calls and respond more quickly because of the IRA funding. And I was looking at the IRS data, and it shows that the IRS actually answered 2.6 million fewer calls this March during the tax filing season. So, and I know Senator Thune asked you about this, if we could get some clarity from you and from your testimony about this, and what is the rate, how often are these calls answered and missed, what percentage of people at the IRS are still working remotely, and what is your timeline for bringing them all back?
What I can tell you is that the response rate to customer calls has been between 80 and 90% every week during this tax filing season, and that's a massive improvement. The IRS hired 5,000 new people to put into customer service, and that relied on funds from the IRA.
My time has expired, but the 8 Corners data call that the IRS gave in early March, the IRS says they've actually answered 2.6 million fewer calls this tax filing season.
There may have been fewer calls, but the rate of response was very much higher.
Thank you.
Hugely
Thank you,
higher.
Madam Secretary.
We do need to move on. Senator Menendez.
The Federal Reserve's emergency lending.
The only matter that's off the table is taking a pass on it. We've got to act. Senator Cornyn, you're next.
Good morning, Madam Secretary. When you testified before this committee almost 2 years ago, you were asked whether inflation was transitory. And you told the committee that you saw important transitory influences at work, but you did not anticipate that inflation would be in any way permanent. You predicted our economy was on track to get back to more normal operation, and that inflation would decline over time, something we all hoped for. To be fair, you weren't the only person who forecast transitory inflation. The chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, did the same, as did the President of the United States. We now know that inflation rose to a level not seen in more than 40 years, and that inflation accelerated, particularly following the enactment of the partisan American Rescue Plan Act in 2021, and then with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, which together added $2.6 trillion to our national debt. Obviously, all this stimulus going into a constrained economy with supply chains the way they were, workforce levels down, obviously created, was like pouring gasoline on the inflation fire. And though inflation has now come down to 6% or so, that's hardly good news to my constituents who are still struggling to keep up with rising costs. We know both record housing costs, which we've talked about a little bit here today, and high grocery bills are squeezing consumers all across the country. And to make matters worse, real average hourly earnings, the cash earnings of all workers, adjusted for inflation, declined last month and are down over the last year. In other words, because of inflation, workers have gotten a pay cut. Well, first we saw high inflation and then higher interest rates, of course, and that brings me to the failure of the Silicon Valley Bank and another bank in this last week. Some have suggested that this was an example of mismanagement at the time of higher interest rates and higher inflation. Others are saying, where are the regulators? Were they asleep at the wheel? Many have suggested that banking regulators need to focus more on regulating banks, protecting depositors and taxpayers, instead of straying off course and examining so-called climate-related risks and other social engineering goals. I think these are all fair points. When you look at the confluence of concerning economic factors, there is one unavoidable truth. We need to get our fiscal house in order, something that the administration pays lip service to, but which seems uninterested in working with Republicans to try to address. And the president's budget proposal, of course, just makes that clear because it offers more taxes, more spending, and more debt. Spending would be at historical levels relative to the economy. The national debt would continue to grow. Social Security and Medicare, which are on a path to insolvency. There is no proposal from the president to deal with these impending disasters. Of course, interest costs to service this debt would reach about $1 trillion annually. Our ability to defend our country in an increasingly dangerous world would be diminished because we'd be spending more money paying interest to the bondholders rather than paying to keep the American people safe. And Americans, of course, would be punished with trillions in higher taxes at a time when tax revenues are already at historical levels. It's not that the American people are taxed too little, it's that the federal government continues to spend too much and incur too much debt, which in turn creates this unvirtuous cycle. One final point, last year the administration pushed through an $80 billion blank check for the IRS without a spending plan. Only in Washington, D.C. would Congress pass an $80 billion spending appropriation without any plan as to how it's going to be implemented. And we were told, well, it will be forthcoming. That's great, but that's the opposite of what you would do it in the real world. First, you would want to know what is the plan, and then you would ask, how much does it take to finance or pay for that plan? Well, now the administration wants another $29 billion, which would bring the total up to $110 billion. This, of course, is going to mean more audits, more red tape, and violate the president's promise that no one paying less than $400,000 in taxes would pay any more. So unfortunately, the president's budget misses the mark, which is disappointing, but unfortunately pretty consistent with what we've seen from this administration.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. Next would be Senator Bennett, followed by...
So let me ask Dr. Bernstein a question. Doc, why did you think inflation was temporary?
The word, of course, transitory is what you're referring to, and I not only believe, but I've said, and this is...
Well, is temporary and transitory, those are synonymous, right?
Yeah, those are they're synonyms. And
okay,
I think
well, tell me why...
But I think transitory was...
Tell me why you thought inflation... I'm going to be accurate. Why in your infinite wisdom, you thought inflation was transitory or temporary?
Well, let me be clear about what we meant at the time. And by the way, and this is contrary to what Ranking Member Scott said earlier, I did not ever say that people didn't understand transitory. What I said was we didn't understand transitory. In fact,
well, that's clear. We can stipulate to that.
That word that word is temporally ambiguous. It meant different things. To some people, it meant 2 weeks. To some people, it meant 2 years. What we meant, and let me answer your question, we thought inflation was going to accelerate and gradually cool down over time. Now, that has turned out to be in fact, the pattern that inflation has taken. But transitory was much too ambiguous a description of that dynamic. Acceleration, cooling.
So let me
now,
stop
inflation
you,
is down
I'm
from 9% to 5%.
Are you telling me that when you said inflation was transitory, you were correct?
No, I'm not saying I was correct or incorrect. What I'm saying was that was an ambiguous...
Like you're saying you were correct.
No, I'm saying that was an ambiguous, an unclear word that was poorly chosen, I think, for that discussion because it meant different things to different people. To me...
Well, has it been transitory?
Inflation has, in fact, behaved much as I just described. We thought inflation was going to accelerate and gradually cool over time, and that is
Chair's going to cut me off. Has it been transitory?
Inflation has accelerated and cooled.
Senator's time's expired. I want to fulfill what you said that I was going to cut you off.
Yeah.
Senator Van Hollen of Maryland's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations to all of you on your nomination.
By saying it was wonderful to see Senator Fetterman here today. As a friend and a freshman colleague, it's great to have him back both in this committee room and here in the Capitol. Thank you for appearing before this committee today. We appreciate your time and your intentionality in answering our questions. I believe that this committee's role is that of oversight, and it's essential for holding leaders in our executive departments accountable for the decisions they make and policies they promote that affect all Americans, whether it be in our housing programs or our macroeconomic policies. America has seen inflation increase by 15.4% since President Biden came into office. As a mom of 2 school-age kids, I see this firsthand every time I go to the grocery store or to the gas pump. Groceries are up 20% and energy costs are up 36%. Families in Alabama, South Carolina, Ohio, and in every community across the country are feeling that pain. Rising prices have cost that typical households, it's about $10,000 in 2 years. Families, parents, and retirees have had to bear the brunt of that persistent inflation over these last 23, 24 months. Dr. Bernstein, I wanted to talk to you following up on what Senator Kennedy was asking you. I know you've been asked once, but I want to make sure that we can clarify this. Do you still stand by your past comments indicating that inflation is transitory?
The problem with the word transitory is that it's become, I think, an unhelpful and much too ambiguous term to describe the trajectory of inflation. It is true that that word or any other word, temporary, any synonym, suggests a condition where inflation accelerates and then inflation decelerates. It slows down. Now, inflation peaked at 9% in June, and most recently was seen at 5%. That's its lowest annual growth rate since November of 2021. So in that sense, the view of acceleration then deceleration was correct. Transitory, however, was too temporally ambiguous a term.
Okay, so you do agree that that term should not have been used?
I think that the term was far too ambiguous to give people a clear sense of what we were thinking.
Yeah, and so one of the things we need you to do as a leader and someone who advises is give the public very clear indications of what we can expect. Unfortunately, the word transitory for many means temporary. It means that it would be short-lived. That's certainly not what we've seen. We've seen inflation above 5% every single month for 23 straight months, and real wages have gone down for 2 straight years. One of the things that Chairman Brown said about you and that was indicated in the letter is that you are open to changing your mind. So once again, just want to directly ask, that word transitory should have never been used.
I don't want to say it should never have been used. I think that the word is not a helpful term. I think it's too ambiguous. I think it doesn't clearly, it does not clearly delineate either what we believe to be the case or the actual trajectory. Now, that said, it is true that we saw inflation accelerate and we've seen inflation cool, but we have a lot more to go.
Would you agree that it's lasted longer than you anticipated when you first used that term?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Bernstein, you've also championed massive spending packages pushed by President Biden over these last 2 years, the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act. You publicly said that they would decrease inflation. The hard truth is that these bills and policies have increased inflation, and the result in some saying that we may be having to have a recession in order to stem inflation. More spending is not the answer. To lower costs for all Americans, we have to stop the reckless spending, reduce regulatory burdens on job creators, and unleash American energy production so that we are not just energy independent, but energy dominant. President Biden has nominated you for the position of the chair of Council of Economic Advisors, of which you currently serve as a member of the council. 72% of Americans believe that the economy is headed in the wrong direction. And as one of the architects of the past 2 years of the failing economic policies of this administration, it is concerning to me that President Biden is asking the Senate to confirm you to this position. Last month, we saw President Biden propose his budget for fiscal year 2024 that includes a $6.9 trillion tax and spending spree that we know will continue to drive inflation even higher. All we have to do is look over the past 2 years for the evidence of that. I would ask you, how can the American people expect different results when this administration and its economic advisors tend to look like they're doubling down on what I believe has not worked?
So thank you for the question, Senator. I respectfully would like to challenge some of the the ways you've teed up some issues there. So first of all, the rescue plan was actually fiscally smaller than the CARES Act. So if that was massive, then the CARES Act was even more massive. The Inflation Reduction Act more than pays for itself. It actually reduces the budget deficit by over $200 billion over 10 years. In terms of the budget, the president's budget, once again, that not only pays for the proposals in the budget, but reduces the deficit by almost $3 trillion over 10 years. So I think that those characterizations go in a different direction than some that you were suggesting, respectfully.
And respectfully, I would disagree. I think if we would be producing more energy, if we were to be spending less money, I think inflation would not have been as quote-unquote transitory as you first put forth.
So if I may, Senator, the production of crude oil under President Biden is
Yes,
the
sir,
highest.
I heard you say that earlier.
Is the highest under any president on record. In fact, under President Biden, on average, the production is 560,000 barrels per day, greater than under the previous administration.
And we see what's happening in Europe and the UK, and you've referenced that earlier. And if we were doing more to help them with their energy needs, I think that we would see those costs go down as well.
Thanks, Senator Britt. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our nominees for being here today. So the sudden failure.
Senator Cornyn's next.
Commissioner, isn't it true that a tax credit or a tax subsidy, dollar for dollar, adds to federal expenditures, and in the case of a $31 trillion debt, it adds to the debt? In other words, tax credits are just another way for the federal government to spend money, correct?
I think technically it's like an outlay or a spend with respect to measuring the deficit.
Thanks, Don.
We talked a little bit about the Inflation Reduction Act. In addition to throwing gasoline on the fire of inflation with $700 billion of additional spending and added to the debt, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, this partisan bill, this was voted on exclusively by our friends on the Democratic side of the aisle, signed into law by the president. It lavishes rich subsidies for electric vehicles, up to $7,500 tax credit for the for electric vehicles. And I want to point out that contrary to the original estimate about how much this would actually cost in terms of outlays, it was originally advertised as being a $30 billion expenditure, and the truth is it looks like it's going to be closer to $200 billion, 6.5 times higher than advertised. The president, as you know, has said by 2032 he wants to, by his magic wand, say that 2/3 of all the vehicles being built will be electric vehicles, even though we now have 280 million cars on the road, and almost all, except 2 or 3 or 4%, are internal combustion engines. Added to that, we know that about 60% of electricity that would be needed to charge those batteries comes from fossil fuels. Only about 22% of electricity is generated by renewables. And we know that basically this mandate and this expenditure, this lavish expenditure for the rich, would do virtually nothing to reduce carbon emissions. But I want to ask you about the supply chain. 77% of the batteries made in the world are made by China. We know they're on a path to increase their capacity to build electric batteries by 7-fold by 2027. Is there any way that this mandate President Biden has ordered with the stroke of his pen, is there any way that it will do anything except increase the sale of Chinese-made batteries here in the United States?
Senator, I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is that what the IRS responsibilities are to issue regulations and guidance for how these credits will be evaluated and who will be eligible for them based on a very intricate array of requirements that are in place. What we are doing now is issuing on a path to issue regulations for comment. And so the questions that you're raising, the tensions, the policy tensions that you're raising will be fleshed out in the comments that we receive on the regulations. And then I will be able to come back and sit in this chair and be at more illuminating in terms of what those comments are and talk to you about what those tensions are. And
You will
maybe
agree with me that those regulations are going to have to be consistent with what is in the law?
Absolutely.
Okay. And actually, the Inflation Reduction Act, misnamed, I might add, actually provides a smorgasbord of credits for electric vehicles. For example, there's a $4,000 credit for used electric vehicles. That's Section 25E. There's a $40,000 tax credit for commercial electric vehicles. That's Section 45W. Yep. And then there's a tax credit for fuel cell cars, which is Section 30B. Do you know if these other credits have the same critical mineral and battery sourcing requirements as the $7,500 EV credit?
Senator, I don't know that at my fingertips, but I can certainly provide you information on that.
I appreciate that, because it appears to me that the American taxpayer will be subsidizing the purchase of Chinese-made commercial and used electric vehicles by virtue of these tax credits. So we'd appreciate your getting back to us with that information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank my colleague. We're going to go to Senator Johnson, but I just want to say, as the lead author of this package of more than $200 billion in clean energy tax credits, we felt very strongly about the point Senator Cornyn's talking about batteries being made in China. And the legislation, and this was at my direction, provides incentives for batteries made in the United States. And it was something we worked on for some time.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just respond briefly, it's not possible to meet that requirement due to this constraint on supply chain and battery manufacturing. So it's either going to subsidize Chinese-made batteries or it's an illusory promise.
Plenty of supply chain issues. The fact is, and I'm going to go to Senator Johnson, the point, and it's something I happen to agree with about batteries being made in China, was something that we took direct action to deal with when we were marking up that legislation. We want batteries made in the United States. We pushed to make that possible with the incentives. Senator Johnson. Excuse me, Senator.
Yeah, I didn't think I was.
I said my colleague.
I appreciate it, but I realize that.
I'm sorry for getting out of order, Senator.
A couple of quick points. Just to my friend's concern about Social Security, I actually have a bill on that. A bill very similar to what President Biden himself voted for when he was in the United States Senate, both the creation of a commission and its final results. I'd invite my friend to look at it. Perhaps we can join it. It would be inherently bipartisan. And my friend made the point that inflation is a global phenomenon. I agree. Absolutely is. When you screw up the greatest economy in the world, it has global consequences. And that's exactly what my friends did. Don't take my word for it. They were warned by Larry Summers, the Secretary of the Treasury for Bill Clinton, distinguished economist. They were warned by Steve Ratner, who managed the auto industry under President Obama. They were warned by Jason Furman, who was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Biden. If you pass something this large, the American Rescue Plan, you're going to have inflation within a year. We did. So if you just listen to your own economists, we could have avoided this. We might not having to take the drastic action we are today. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield.
This joint session of the Subcommittee on Economic Growth, Energy Policy, and Regulatory Affairs and the Subcommittee on Healthcare and Financial Services will come to order. We want to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. Without objection, the chair may declare a recess at any time. I recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. I ask unanimous consent for Representative LaTurner of Kansas to waive on to the committee for the purpose of asking questions during this hearing. Without objection, so ordered. Today's hearing will examine what ESG, environmental, social, and governance initiatives really mean for workers and consumers, and how the decisions made in boardrooms and global climate conferences have real-world impacts here at home. What are social impacts of using ideological activism to change corporate behavior, to change and really shape it? And that's the question, really a vital question we need to answer here today. A few weeks ago, we heard from two very well-known and very well-respected state attorneys general about the dangers of what ESG policies mean when in the hands of activist asset managers. We know that asset managers control an estimated and really astounding $126 trillion, and that is with a T, trillion dollars, in financial resources and almost 30% of all global financial assets. This type of power and influence extends far beyond what most people can really even conceive of. And just like they say, with great power comes great responsibility. Millions of Americans across the country trust their investments will be used to make a profit, and hopefully one that they can live on comfortably in retirement. Because what we're really after here when we're all investing in the long term is financial security. But these days, it's not crazy for many Americans to wonder, will I even be able to afford retirement? This administration has driven inflation through the roof. It's at a 40-year high and pushed the economy to the brink of a major recession, which we all pray won't happen, but it very well could in the next year. Now, due to Democrats' ESG push, asset managers are prioritizing ESG goals over profit and risking Americans' hard-earned money. With ESG investing, businesses are now tasked with accounting not only for their own carbon footprints, but maybe the footprint of their contractors and suppliers, the race and gender of their corporate boards, instead of the merit and performance of those same corporate board members. These are all factors that have come to be valued, and valued at least to activists and dominant asset managers and woke corporate boardrooms, as much, if not higher, than the actual returns that a business provides to their shareholders. To secure capital, the lifeblood of any business, companies, large and small, now must hire teams of lawyers and compliance consultants to comb through internal data and estimate exactly what their greenhouse gas emissions might or may be, or how many points they've scored with activist organizations for checking the right boxes on an ever-changing list of leftist social norms. Somehow, this financial gamble, one that's played with your money and your investments, is supposed to still maximize returns for pensions and 401ks. In fact, the Biden administration is placing political ESG priorities over American retirements. The Department of Labor Prudence and Loyalty final rule allows fiduciaries to consider climate change as well as other ESG factors when making investment decisions. President Biden actually vetoed Congress's bipartisan resolution overturning this rule, financially risking the retirements of millions of Americans. This certainly sounds like the Biden administration is sending mixed signals when it comes to American retirements and encouraging them, as we heard as the last hearing with the state AGs, to violate their fiduciary duties. Rules do not have a force of, well, they shouldn't have a force of law, and rules are below laws. That's what we're all here for. ESG is being utilized in an attempt to rewrite the fabric of America with, unfortunately, woke policies that deliver nothing but higher prices, fewer market choices, cultural oppression, not to mention jeopardizing returns on investments for retirees and regular Americans. I thank the witnesses for appearing here today and for their willingness to testify on this important issue. And with that, I ask unanimous consent to submit 3 statements into the record. Corporate collusion by Life Powered, keeping politics out of Texas pensions by the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and energy discrimination by Life Powered. Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Powell, as you know, when the COVID-19 pandemic started, the Federal Reserve began a round of quantitative easing, referred to as QE4. Like many COVID policies, this program dragged on, not ending until March of 2022. To conduct this program, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet with short-term interest-bearing liabilities on one side and long-term interest-bearing assets on the other. And this was at a time of historically low interest rates. When predictably, expansionary fiscal and monetary policy sent inflation to the highest level in 40 years, the Fed was forced to raise interest rates rapidly. Now, going back to one of my colleagues' questions about the bank losses and the result of that being poor management and failing to hedge against the interest rate environment, is that a fair summation that management and failure to hedge is what caused some of the bank losses?
Certainly, many banks manage the interest rate risk that came along through that technique.
but some did not. Is that correct?
Some did not.
In October, the Fed suspended its remittances to the Treasury due to losses. Mercatus Center estimates that the lost revenue for the Treasury will result in $760 billion over the next 10 years. And so it does concern me that Treasury is blaming banks for mismanagement when you yourself had to stop remittances and will suffer losses. Now, when the Fed prepared its and I said Treasury Fed, but semi-annual monetary policy reports through the time of QE4, none of those reports mentioned interest rate risk would impact the government's finances. Should that have been disclosed, or did the Fed not understand its own risk in correlation to the interest rate environment?
Well, so what we do, we remit all of our profits, right? And in the era of QE, those profits were enormous. We remitted something like $1.2 trillion in profits to the Treasury Department because, you know, we're funding purchases of long-term assets with issuance, as you pointed out, of overnight, lower rate instruments. So, you know, in a way, that's what was happening during the QE era. As we now enter an era of raising rates, that'll turn around a little bit. But ultimately, though, we don't manage at all for fiscal reasons. What we're managing to is maximum employment and price stability, and we're using our tools to achieve that. So we don't think of ourselves as trying to attain some kind of fiscal goal one way or the other.
But what about as far as, well, I guess I'll ask this question. When you look at, the roughly $700 billion in blow to the Treasury, how's that going to impact the President and Congress's kind of economic plans and policies going forward? I mean, is it going to impact negatively?
It's not. It doesn't affect spending, right? It doesn't affect. Congress appropriates money, the executive branch spends it. It affects. It will mean that more borrowing has to take place, and that could raise rates very marginally at the margin. But that's how it would affect the budget, but it wouldn't be a major effect on the budget.
Well, I didn't ask about the budget moreover than our overall economic goals. And I think what I think a lot of us are getting at is when you look at Main Street America, when you look at mortgage rates and how it's impacting, families' abilities to get a mortgage. And so someone who was eligible for $300,000 to buy a home now is no longer eligible for that home. You have people that are now upside down due to this, expansionary, interest rate environment. And I have concerns about future raises and the impact that's going to have on small businesses, availability of credit, and again, your average homeowner. And the people that pay that or bear the burden of that are your lower income and your middle class families. Now, when you look at Silicon Valley Bank, which is supervised by the Fed, again, I get back to when you look at the interest rate increases, why there was not more warning or hedging from you as the impact it may have on the fiscal system, the financial system, and the banking system, because as we've well acknowledged, both sides of the aisle, that there was some poor management, but the regulators and the communication from the government was lacking. And Mr. Chairman, I am out of time. Mr. Powell, thank you for being here, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. I think you're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel here. Appreciate your investment of time today. I wanted to touch, with the limited time that we have, on a couple of the President or the administration's key policy priorities, energy or climate, as well as immigration/border and how they impact the economy. And a couple of questions to Mr. McBride first. Mr. McBride, the President has stated many times that his proposed tax reforms would help average Americans. How would you reconcile that or contrast that, or perhaps, with the estimate that 80% of the electric vehicle tax credits are going to households with incomes of $100,000 or higher?
Well, clearly that is, like you describe and like anybody can recognize when they look at the sticker prices on electric vehicles, that those are luxury goods. They are not targeting a low-income community with those products. Those are luxury goods that, as good as they are for the planet perhaps, they are very expensive, and they have been expensive for, ever since they've been produced. And so these tax credits, of course, then go to high-income individuals that can afford a $50,000, $67,000, up to $80,000 is what is allowed under these new tax credits towards that's the sticker price of an electric vehicle. Then there's a loophole around that, so that around that provision, and then the income provision. So that is the leasing loophole. And so none of the restrictions, as I understand it, apply to vehicles, electric vehicles that are leased. You can get the credit. It basically flows through the leasing company to the consumer. So, someone making millions of dollars a year, for instance, could lease an electric vehicle and benefit from the credit that way.
Yeah, it's really just obscene that we would, on the backs of regular taxpayers, subsidize vehicles for the wealthiest of Americans. And then as we're trying to force Americans to electric vehicles and restrict production of gas-powered vehicles, what's going to happen to the prices of gas-powered vehicles as their supply is limited? What is that going to do? We can only imagine and speculate what that will do. I also, consistent with what you said, reports that I've read are that the vast majority of electric vehicle owners, you use the term luxury, it is a secondary vehicle because of the impractical nature of it. It's impractical, insufficient number of charging stations, impractical for long distance travel, that sort of thing. The Biden energy agenda more broadly, combined with the massive inflationary spending, combined with the response, I would suggest misguided response of massively raising interest rates. So the housing prices are up, inflation is up, grocery prices are up, utility prices are up, gas prices are up. So let's sock the American people with higher interest rates to make it so they can't afford to buy homes, or we make the average cost of a mortgage go up about 50%. So your thoughts on how is his doubling down on his Green New Deal tax credits, how's that going to impact the economic or financial future for average Americans?
Well, I think it was sold as an Inflation Reduction Act. Of course, that's the title. And that was all premised on the idea that it would reduce deficits, which was what was originally thought based on the original score from CBO and JCT. We now know that that score was off. It was off in the direction of actually underestimating the cost of these green credits greatly. And so we now, based on the new scores from JCT, it appears the IRA legislation as a whole increases deficits. It's not clear how much. We should hopefully get a new score for the entire bill to find that out. But if there's no deficit reduction in this bill, then there goes the idea that it reduces inflation.
Mr. Pomerleau, with the limited time that we have, I saw a study that says the net cost of illegal immigration in the United States, 16 million or more illegals in the country now, is about $150 billion last year, roughly $9,000 per illegal. Could you speak to the cost to the American taxpayer for the flow of illegals into the country?
Thanks for your question, but this is a little outside of my area of expertise. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on this issue in particular.
Well, I'll just say with the 8 seconds I've got left, it's funny, we have a law in this country where if legal immigrants can't be on the public dole, but illegal immigrants, if you break the law, your first act on the soil of the United States is to break the law, then we give you all the social safety nets, the social welfare, the health care, the social services that we can provide to you. So it's really incredible as we reward illegal immigration. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I think Senator Daines of Montana is recognized.
Chairman, thank you. Mr. Powell, good to have you here this morning. In Montana, as well as the Mountain West, inflation remains above 5%. In fact, we're higher than any other region in the nation, whether it's gas stations, grocery stores, increasing prices, and its real-life impacts remain truly a top-of-mind and daily issue for Montanans. With inflation remaining stubbornly high, I can't help but reflect on the warning signs that were ignored by my colleagues across the aisle while they raced to push through trillions of dollars in partisan spending disguised as COVID relief And now the American people are bearing the brunt of this reckless spending. In fact, for the average American, unless you've received a nearly 16% pay raise over the past 2 years, you've effectively received a pay cut. Chair Powell, I urge you and the Fed to remain vigilant and steadfast in your effort to rein in inflation for the sake of all Americans. Unfortunately, record high inflation is not the only crisis the Fed is having to navigate. While bank regulators were more focused on climate change than actually regulating the banks under their supervision, several coastal banks collapsed and caused panic across the banking sector. Before the dust even settled, several of my colleagues across the aisle immediately began calling for increased regulations and greater capital requirements for banks, with little appreciation for the negative impacts these changes would have on small and mid-sized banks across the country. I've heard from community banks across Montana who are justifiably concerned that they will be wrongfully punished for the actions of a few poorly regulated and poorly managed banks. You mentioned several times in your testimony yesterday and again here today that the U.S. banks remain strong and well capitalized. Chair Powell, if banks are so well capitalized, why the urgency now to increase capital requirements that would really prevent another Silicon Valley Bank?
Well, let me say first that I think we don't have a final proposal to talk about yet. When we do, we'll be able to talk much more specifically about it. But for community banks and banks, any banks under $100 billion, this is I don't think they're going to be part of this proposal. So we're really talking about principally the very largest banks, the GSIBs, and to a lesser extent, the banks, the regionals, and then the banks between 100 and 250. And yes, the right question. The question is more capital the answer? And we'll be addressing that. We'll be making a proposal. We'll be soliciting public comment on that. I'm well aware that there's a trade-off here. More capital means more stable banks. It means stronger banks, but there's also a trade-off there. And with capital, you've got to make a judgment about where you draw that line.
Yeah, and to that point, increasing the capital requirements could in turn decrease lending. Will the impact this have on small businesses who may not be able to get a loan be taken into account before you finalize a proposal?
Yes. I mean, the thing is, stronger capital means banks will be able to continue to lend during difficult times too, right? So that's why we do it, is for those stressful times. But it is a judgment call, and there's a lot of science and arithmetic that goes into it. But ultimately, deciding how high to go is a challenging question. And we're going to be making a proposal, and I'll personally be listening carefully to the comments.
You alluded to focus more on the GSIBs and trying to spare the smaller banks, perhaps, from the impact. And I realize the proposal is still being developed, is not finally baked yet. But are you prepared to commit to sparing the smaller community banks from changes the Fed might propose on capital requirements?
So let me say, my understanding is that the proposal doesn't affect banks under $100 billion, and I would have serious questions as to why it would. And particularly, most community banks, for example, in your state, are much smaller than $100 billion, and I don't know why we would be looking at their capital. They're generally quite well capitalized.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn on inflation, back to that earlier statement. I appreciate the wait-and-see approach the FMOC took at its most recent meeting. But as I noted in my remarks, inflation does remain stubbornly high, particularly in the Mountain West, and labor markets remain as tight as we've ever seen. It was noted, however, that the committee is poised to continue raising rates later this year. My final question, could you expand just a bit more on your outlook for the rest of the year and speak to your continued commitment to do whatever is necessary to bring inflation back to your 2% target?
Yes, so I think if you look at the committee's forecasts, and mine are very similar, we expect modest growth going forward. growth in the below the sort of longer run growth rate of the United States economy, which is around 2% or a little bit less, growth lower than that. And we expect the labor market to continue to gradually cool off. And with that, there's an expectation that inflation will continue to move down later this year. And if things happen that are sort of broadly in keeping with that, the strong majority of the committee believes that it will be appropriate to raise the federal funds rate again once or twice by the end of the year. A strong majority came down on twice between now and the end of the year. So I think the data will tell us what to do. I think the point of our meeting, the last meeting, was really to moderate the pace of our decision-making on this because, it was very important to move quickly last year, and we did. It's not so important now because we've come so far and we're relatively close, we think, to where we need to get. But we will, people should believe, and broadly speaking, the data show that they do believe, that we will do what it takes to get inflation down to 2% over time.
Thank you. Senator Haggerty from
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, Biden wants Americans to believe his policies are working, but his borrow, tax, and spend Bidenomics created a 40-year high inflation, causing families to suffer from skyrocketing energy and grocery costs and discouraging increases of rent and mortgages. While Biden talks about his hourly wages have increased, the reality is that the prices have risen faster and incomes actually reduced. According to the Committee to Unleash Prosperity, using the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the number of hours worked per week have declined. This amounts to the average family losing $5,600 in annual purchasing power. The Republican House majority is working to correct this and having recently passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act to rein in government overreach and limit inflationary spending, creating jobs. In conclusion, God bless our troops who successfully protected America for 20 years as the global war on terrorism continues, moving from the Afghanistan safe haven to America with Biden open borders. I yield back.
Well, we just heard my friend from Nebraska say that Biden wants Bidenomics to be all about restoring the American dream. Well, for most Americans, it's turning out to be a nightmare. Inflation brought on by the Biden administration's misguided policies has Americans trying to figure out how to afford everyday necessities. One thing that they are not buying is the Biden's administration latest catchwords, Bidenomics. Over the 4th of July break, I held meetings in 24 of Iowa's 99 counties. There's a very common theme there. That common theme was that families and businesses are struggling with the economic impact of inflation. It's not just Iowans who are feeling the pain from the economy under the Biden administration. According to a recent Associated Press survey, only 34% of Americans approve of President Biden's handling of our economy. President Biden's message to these Americans is, don't believe your bank accounts. Well, Madam President, that message doesn't resonate. Iowa families are hit with ballooning bills and higher prices at every corner. For 2 years, Iowans have been stretched thin because of decades-high inflation stoked by Democrats' reckless $2 trillion spending spree, a spending spree that would not have happened if they had listened to their own Democrat economists, particularly the outstanding Harvard economist and former Secretary of Treasury in the Clinton administration and economic advisors to other Democratic presidents. Their own Larry Summers told them before this president took over that the economy was already turning around. Don't spend any more money or you will have inflation. So what do we see? On average, American consumers are facing prices that are 16% higher today than when Biden took office. While prices have climbed, wages have failed to keep up. American workers have seen their paychecks shrink by more than 3% in real terms. Now, we heard the word transitory, that inflation was going to be transitory, so you didn't need to worry about it. And this was as the Biden administration claimed when they took office. And of course, inflation has proved persistent. Just remember, 1.4% inflation the day this president took office. It rose to 9.1% a year ago and is still at 4.5%. In its effort to tame inflation, the Fed has hiked interest rates to the highest level in 16 years, putting mortgages, putting businesses and their loans out of reach for more and more Americans. Half of the small businesses report delaying plans to grow their business due to rising interest cost. A rebranding of his far-left agenda as Bidenomics is cold comfort for Iowans and Americans everywhere who are coping with rising prices, falling real wages, and ballooning interest rates. As we saw with last year's partisan tax and spending package that the Democrats named the Inflation Reduction Act, as you see, labels are often deceiving. Contrary to the bill's name, this partisan tax and spending package had nothing to do with reducing inflation or providing relief to Americans struggling with inflation. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, and I emphasize the word nonpartisan, confirmed it, meaning the Inflation Reduction Act will worsen inflation. And of course, recent estimates show that it will add hundreds of billions more to the nation's credit card. Rather than providing relief for Americans struggling to make ends meet, this legislation raised Americans' taxes while showering Democrat-favored industries with corporate handouts, with the government taking an increasing role in choosing winners and losers in our economy. Unless you're a corporation or a wealthy individual looking to buy an $80,000 electric SUV, the Democrat Inflation Enhancement Act has little to offer. And I think changing the name from the Inflation Reduction Act to the Inflation Enhancement Act is exactly the intellectually honest thing to do. Bidenomics isn't about growing the economy from the middle out or the bottom up, as the president claims in almost every speech. It's the same old top-down, big government agenda Democrats have always pursued. It means then, as you know, higher taxes, more reckless spending, and a growing national debt as far as the eye can see into the future. It's time for a change in policy, not merely a change in messaging. President Biden needs to redirect his message to the facts, the real facts of life, because Bidenomics is not selling.
Madam President, Senator from Nebraska.
Thank you, Madam President. When it comes to the economy, we hear a lot about numbers, the inflation rate, how much more groceries cost, or how many businesses are struggling to find employees. Those numbers are important. They tell us the big picture story of where our economy is and where it's going. And right now, that's not a pretty picture. But as elected representatives, we work for our people. It is critical that we listen to the voices of the people who live in our states and who are being deeply affected by the numbers we read in Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal. In a speech he made last week, President Biden promised that his economic policy is helping across the board, quote, in rural America, the heartland, all across America, end quote. He claimed that Bidenomics is the silver bullet for financial struggles among middle-class Americans around the country. I don't know who the president is talking to, but my experience hearing from Americans in the heartland is a lot different than what he said in that speech. Many Nebraskans are struggling under unforgiving load of inflation, kick-started by this administration's almost $2 trillion stimulus package in 2021. So today, let's zoom in on Nebraska. When I'm back in my home state, I'm constantly hearing stories of hardship from my fellow Nebraskans, whether they're farmers, teachers, or small business owners. It is truly painful to hear about some of the experience people are having due to inflation. So let me tell you about Bidenomics in Nebraska. When I stopped by a coffee shop in 2022, the owner told me his electric bill had skyrocketed from $40 a month to over $300 a month. And that coffee shop owner is now gone. He couldn't afford Bidenomics, and he closed his shop. That is Bidenomics in Nebraska. A year later, not much has changed. As one of our Nebraska farmers told me a few weeks ago, quote, prices take the elevator up, but the stairs down, end quote. Inflation causes costs to rise quickly, and they stay up there for a long time. One big economically irresponsible move from the administration, well, that sets the stage for years of struggle. That is Bidenomics in Nebraska. Several rural businesses in the state shared their struggles with a local newspaper earlier this year. Many of these business owners feel, quote, at a loss for what to do as their livelihoods crumble under the pressure. A honey farmer shared that consistently rising prices squeeze his family into a difficult position when doing things as simple as putting their honey in jars. Sometimes they could only afford to get the container. Sometimes they could only afford to get the lids, but not both. He said, quote, we're kind of forgotten about way out here, end quote. That is Bidenomics in Nebraska. That doesn't line up with the president's boasts of an economy that works for middle-class Americans in the heartland. Instead, while the Biden administration chatters on about its support for the middle class, thousands of people in that category are pulling out all the stops to pay their necessary expenses. The Salvation Army of Lincoln, Nebraska, reported a couple months ago that it has seen a 50% increase in service requests in just a year. People are going to charities to get help, paying rent and utilities as the economy suffers. A Salvation Army officer said, quote, "For people who are on medical equipment, having their electricity on is a very important aspect," end quote. That is Bidenomics in Nebraska. The president has a middle-class problem. Average Americans are hollowing out their savings, and they're taking on record debt just to keep up with these stunning levels of inflation, or as the White House likes to call it, Bidenomics. The president said last week, quote, "Bidenomics is just another way of saying restoring the American dream," end quote. Wrong. Since when does the American dream include taking a second job just to be able to afford rent, or having to choose between containers and lids for honey jars, or racking your brain for ways to catch up on an electricity bill that will not stop rising? The president should step off the podium. He should stop delivering empty promises. And he should actually get down to business, fixing the bloated economy that he has created. Nebraskans are not listening to the administration's inflated claims about helping the middle class, but they are listening to the mortgage increases and to their dwindling savings accounts. Americans know what Bidenomics look like, and it looks like failed leadership. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for a closing statement. So just heard some interesting things that your department is in favor of consumer choice, and yet it's either 50% would not comply or 96%. Regardless, they're both large numbers, and we're talking about less choice and limited choices. And then a colleague of mine said that this is going to result in massive savings and less pollution. Well, who would be against that? Everybody would be before that. That's ridiculous to say that. Unfortunately, it's not true, that statement. Saving money and reducing waste. So we're to be told that the federal government is going to save us money and reduce waste and is going to be highly efficient and make sure our products are. So it's a question of really, do you trust the federal government or do you trust the private sector? And many people trust the federal government to be more efficient than the private sector. I'm not amongst them. I believe in the private sector. I'll give you an example. There was a home builder that in Texas, as you may imagine, we have a lot high electricity bills in the summer, and they had a really insulated home, and they would brag about it because instead of $700 a month in electric bills that you would have in a regular home, their insulation was so good it was only going to be $60 a month. They did that on their own in the free market because it was a selling point. I almost bought a house. I didn't even really like the house, but I like $60 a month bills for electricity in July. So I trust the free markets and the private sector to say, hey, look at my gas stove is so much more efficient. You're going to use less energy. I'd like to use less energy. And then we had a colleague say that she was bragging about Bidenomics, and Joe Biden lowered inflation. I mean, that is really high quality spin. It really is, because the inflation rate, everybody agrees, was 1.4% before he got into office. It's 3% today, which is 214% higher than it was when he took office. But somehow magically he lowered it. That was a peach. But in 2021 it was at 7%. In 2022 it was at 6.5. So if a car cost 20 grand back in 2021 when he took office, and if the inflation rate had remained constant, that car would cost $20,852. But where we saw the inflation rate actually go, that car would cost $23,475 or $2,623 more, or 17% more than it would have otherwise cost. But magically, he lowered inflation for us. So I want to thank him for that. And I'm grateful for the Department of Energy to decide finally to, Dr. Richmond, for you to be here and to testify today. And that you recognize Congress's authority to call witnesses and discuss Article 2 rulemaking authority. So if anything, that was a plus and a win for our republic. So this Congress and the majority has established a relentless pursuit of holding the administration accountable for what we believe are unclear, unlawful, and un-American regulations. The fact that the Department of Energy had to publish a misinformation page on home appliance standards on the agency's website tells the American people that we all need, tells us all that we need to know about the administration's priorities. We've seen that in responses to the majority's questions even today. We've also heard them loud and clear in the earlier hearings on gas stove rules with non-governmental witnesses. We've even heard the Vice President, Kamala Harris, call on the United States to reduce population in recent climate change speeches, which is rather an unbelievable statement from a Vice President. This administration simply does not care about what's best for the American people and disrespects how much Americans, I trust the American people to live their lives in the best way possible. This Congress on the gas stoves rule became a lightning rod for debate on governmental overreach extending into those choices. Because what can be more sacred than an American's right to a gas stove? Even beyond the gas stove rules, the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy has expended countless taxpayer resources in a backward effort to limit customer choice. Gas stoves, light bulbs, dishwashers, clothes dryers, gas furnaces, water heaters, air conditioners, refrigerators, and as we heard today, the list goes on and on. This is something of the likes of which the American people have really never seen. It's important that we hear from the department on the development processes, the substance of all proposed and finalized rules related to home appliances. Because another thing that really concerns me is passing a rule first and then seeing its effects. I'd rather really know what the effects are going to be before a rule is passed. And career bureaucrats that we've seen across the administration are running wild with EPCA to take certain products off the market with unjustified cost analysis, vague health studies that since have been walked back, and de facto bans on healthy and safe products the American people rely every day on. The unelected agency employees apparently have no check on the practicality of the rulemaking, considering that the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy doesn't have a confirmed official to hold it accountable. But not only that, the department leadership does not even have the subject matter depth to understand the breadth and impact of these rulemaking rulmakings, considering the DOE needed to have over 2 months to decide if its staff was even going to be ready to testify before Congress. And the agencies need to step up and stop passing the buck. So I am very glad that you were here today. Just look at what the DOE is doing with energy efficiency standards, but even the proposed rules still in draft are garnering significant pushback, like energy efficiency standards for water heaters. But listen, I want to thank you all for coming, and you have to understand Congress can't and won't pass the buck. We are elected by the people, so we have to do our jobs. And in conclusion, I urge the department to reconsider, reevaluate, and withdraw some of these proposed rulemakings in light of these valid and pressing concerns. We're all about efficiency, and again, I trust the free market to be as efficient as possible because it's a selling point when you're selling your product. And I look forward to working with you to achieve these results, and I want to thank everybody here, and thank you very much. With that,
I just simply want to note that the gentlelady was referencing the WIN Act as a whole, and this, my bill is a provision. So this is not a subsidy. This does allow for water users to save on interest, which I think is very important for the American taxpayer, especially since trillions of dollars were spent unnecessarily in the last Congress. We're at $32 trillion in debt. Inflation it has been skyrocketing. It is so difficult for the American people to afford to live right now, and unfortunately, that's only due to bad policy, bad energy policy that made our energy less secure and less affordable. So again, this is not as the WIN Act as a whole. This is a provision to that bill, which will generate, as the CBO estimates, $639 million. So this is a great common sense piece of legislation. I'm honored to introduce this, save the American taxpayers money, and generate money to the Treasury.
Would the gentlelady yield?
I would.
The estimate, let me clarify, was for Section 4011. It wasn't for the entire WIN Act. Thank you.
I would disagree with that, as I have the CBO citing saying that this would generate $639 million. And I'm here to support the water users, the American taxpayers, to give them an opportunity to save on interest and of course, all the burdensome paperwork that goes into projects like this. And so again, I'm honored to introduce this piece of legislation, and I urge adoption of HR 3675. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Well, Joe Biden is making life worse for American families. When you ask people, is your life better or worse under the Biden policies, only 1 in 5 people say that it's actually made life better. More than 2.5 times as many people said the Biden policies have made their life worse. So the Democrats are completely out of touch with the American people. Clearly, every weekend at home, I continue to hear about the high prices, and Joe Biden is the president of high prices. And you think with such a bad report card, the president would let up a little, but he didn't. This past week, he accelerated his attacks on affordable American energy. Look, prices are up 16% since he's taken over. People need some relief, but Joe Biden is so desperate to win the support of the environmental extremists that will do whatever they want. And that's why he's come out with new attacks on oil and gas, which are going to raise the cost at the pump, raise the cost in the grocery store, and to heat or cool your home. And these attacks are so bad that they're going to force a number of oil and gas workers to lose their job, and that could be tens of thousands. And for my home state of Wyoming, we are America's energy breadbasket. It's going to be especially devastating. You know, I often wonder if these elitists from the coast have any clue and an understanding of where their energy comes from and where their food comes from. My former colleague Mike Enzi used to always talk about a book called The Hidden America. It was from coal miners to cowboys, the unseen Americans who really make this country work. And Joe Biden could learn a lot from reading the book and from talking to the coal miners and the cowboys all across this country. Because it is these heroes, these hard-working heroes, who are the ones that are most being hurt by Joe Biden and the Democrats who are out of touch with America.
Thanks, John.
Madam President.
The Republican leaders recognized.
The Biden administration has been working overtime to sell the American people a fantasy. The president would like working families who struggled under 2 years of soaring inflation believe they're afraid that Bidenomics is working for America. The White House press secretary declared recently that, quote, people are feeling better about their personal finances. If only that were true. Unfortunately, the American people have too many reasons to believe their financial outlook is worse today, worse than when the president took office. According to a survey conducted last month, just 24% of voters say the American economy is on the right track. Less than a third buy the claim that this administration's policies are bringing costs down for working families, and just 22% think inflation is getting any better. So, Madam President, no matter how many ways the administration officials spin the numbers, folks who work for a living and manage a family budget know that Bidenomics has made their lives harder. They know that prices have risen 16.6% since the president took office, because they feel it every time they pay their bills. Energy prices, for example, are 38% higher than they were in January of 2021. Groceries are 20% more expensive. In Washington State, one man reported recently that soaring rent had forced him to move, take on a longer commute, spend more on gas, and put his goal of home ownership on hold. In Illinois, one woman told a reporter recently she had paid $90 for groceries that would feed her family of 3 for 3 days and might have to start visiting food pantries. Quote, "You have no choice but to sacrifice," she said. So look at it this way. During the first terms of the last 4 administrations before this one, year-on-year inflation never cracked 4%. Under President Biden, it's happened 26 times. To borrow the president's own phrase, that is Bidenomics in action. As one top Democrat economist put it last year, this is Biden's inflation, and he needs to own it. So it's fitting that the president has finally slapped his name on our current economic situation. He's right to take credit. Working families won't be in this mess if he hadn't spent his first few months in office ramming $2 trillion in left-wing spending down the throat of our economy. So owning the runaway inflation Washington Democrats helped produce is one thing, but it's about time they focused on fixing it. Now, on a different matter, tomorrow the Prime Minister Meloni of Italy will visit Washington for a series of meetings. I look forward to welcoming her to the Capitol at an important time for our two countries' friendship and for Italy's role in the transatlantic alliance. Prime Minister Meloni took office as Europe faced its first large-scale land war in decades, and Italy faced the increasing economic vulnerabilities of reliance on China. By all accounts, she's addressed these challenges head-on. The Prime Minister has repeatedly asserted Italy's commitment to helping Ukraine defeat Russian aggression and rebuild its economy. And importantly, like some leaders, she's done so with refreshing clarity to the Italian people about their own country's concrete interests in helping Ukraine defend itself. Earlier this spring, in an address to the Italian Senate, Prime Minister Meloni summed up the reality. She said, "We are also sending arms to Ukrainians to prevent the possibility of having to use them ourselves one day. We're sending arms to Ukraine also to keep the war far away from the rest of Europe and our home." Not vaguely defining philanthropy, just cold, hard investments in our own country. At the NATO summit in Vilnius earlier this month, Italy's leader rightly declared that, quote, "Our freedom has a cost. What is invested in defense comes back tenfold, 100-fold, in terms of our ability to defend our national interests." Secretary General Stoltenberg has recognized that Prime Minister's strong personal commitment to NATO and to our transatlantic alliance. And the Italian government has expressed its intention to accelerate progress toward the alliance's 2% defense spending target. I hope and expect to see Italy and all NATO allies meet this goal. This shift in Italy's approach to defense and security policy reflects what allies are recognizing across Europe, that the long holiday from history is over, and that investments in hard power are overdue. But as Prime Minister Meloni meets with President Biden tomorrow, it's important to remember that our shared interests extend beyond Europe. Italy is rightly concerned about growing instability, terrorism, and migration flows in Africa, yet another area where Russian and Chinese influence has played a corrosive and threatening role. America has a shared interest in keeping pressure on the global terrorist resurgence that has followed the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. I'm also encouraged that the Italian government is unraveling its involvement in China's so-called Belt and Road Initiative, another indication that European allies are taking steps to protect themselves against China's economic coercion. So if we are serious about competition with the PRC, we need to work more closely with allies and partners who share our interest in preserving a world of free and fair trade and secure policy chains. So I'm hopeful that President Biden and Prime Minister Maloney have a productive meeting tomorrow. I look forward to discussing our two nations' common challenges and priorities with her directly. In the meantime, I'm hopeful our colleagues will continue to work diligently to provide for the common defense and equip America and our allies to meet and deter common threats. I suggest the absent quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. Ms. Baldwin.
I think we're all aware, Mr. President, that parts of our world are on fire. The world is on fire in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. The world is on fire in the Middle East. I wouldn't describe the world as being on fire in the Indo-Pacific, but there's certainly embers, and they are smoldering. And I think it's clear to most Americans, Mr. President, that President Xi in China, President Putin in Russia, and the Ayatollah in Iran are working together. And their objective is to have Russia dominate Central and Eastern Europe, to have the Ayatollah in Iran dominate the Middle East. The Ayatollah, of course, has funded and supports Hamas. There's no cause in the world, none, that can justify what Hamas did to the innocent people of Israel. The people of Hamas are so evil they will kill you and drink your blood out of a boot. And President Xi and President Putin and the Ayatollah in Iran are just fine with that. And the third objective of China, Russia, and Iran is to allow China to dominate the Indo-Pacific and be free to make moves in sub-Saharan Africa and in South America. Parts of the world are on fire. America is about to find out what it is made of, because the world I just described is not a world that's safe for America. But as we meet these challenges, Mr. President, and by God, we will meet them. We will meet them. While we're doing that, Mr. President, I don't want us to forget about our homeland. We've got a lot of problems domestically, and I don't want us to lose sight of them. I think about them every day. I know you do too, Mr. President. We still have millions of Americans who are too poor to be sick, despite the fact that we have the best quality of health care in America in all of human history. Notice I didn't say that we have the best way of delivering that health care, but we have the best quality of health care in all of human history. But we've got people in this country, many of them are middle class, who are too poor to be sick. Since the Affordable Care Act passed, we were told it was going to make our lives better. It was going to make health insurance more accessible and cheaper since the Affordable Health Care Act is passed. Health insurance premiums have tripled. We also know domestically, Mr. President, that our border is an open, bleeding wound. It is an open, bleeding wound. And it is within the power of this Congress to fix that. But none of those domestic problems that I just described, and I could continue with others, as I know you could too, Mr. President, is hurting the American people as much as President Biden's inflation. Not a single one. President Biden's inflation is gutting the American people like a fish. It is a cancer on the American dream. In my state alone, in Louisiana, we're not a wealthy state. My people are pretty middle class. They get up every day, they go to work, they obey the law. They try to do the right thing by their kids, try to save a little for retirement. The median household income for a family of four in my state's $55,000 a year. A lot of states are above us, some are below us. President Biden's inflation, which is man-made, and that man's name is Joe Biden, is costing my people, the average Louisiana family, $806, not a year, a month. $806 a month. That's $9,700 a year. Now imagine if you were making $55,000 a year and you've got to come out of pocket with an extra $9,700 a year. You blow through your savings. You max out your credit card. You borrow from your children's college education plan. You borrow from relatives. And then what do you do? Now, I know what some of my colleagues are thinking, but Kennedy, we're doing better on inflation. And we are. And I am so thankful. A year ago, inflation in this country was 8.2%. Today it's 3.7%, and I am so happy. And I hope it continues to go down. But it is important for us to remember what that means. A reduction of inflation from 8.2% to 3.7%, which is still, of course, too high, just means that inflation is rising less rapidly. We still have inflation. Prices are still high. They're just not going, and they continue to go up. They're just not going up as quickly as they were. Now, that's a good thing, but it doesn't solve the problem. That's what we call disinflation. When inflation is rising and we stop it from rising so quickly, that's called disinflation. But that's not what most Americans care about, though that's important to them. What they care about is the prices going down, and that's de-inflation. And we do not have de-inflation. The point I'm trying to make is we're stuck with these high prices. If they get inflation down to zero, those high prices are not going down. They're going to remain the same, Mr. President. They're just not going to rise as quickly. We are stuck. The American people are stuck with these high prices because of the Biden administration. Now, I could cite you, Mr. President, all the sterile statistics you would like. But I want to try to describe in specific terms what it's like for my people to go to the grocery store. This is an exaggeration, but not by much, to have to think about, well, do I have to sell blood plasma today in order to go to the grocery store? Do I have to draw down on the second mortgage on my home in order to go to the grocery store? Since President Biden has been in office, consumer goods in the United States of America are up 17%. Electricity is up 25%. Eggs are up 29%. They're not going down, folks. Even if inflation goes to zero, those prices aren't going down. Potato chips up 30%, bread up 28%, coffee 30%, rice 26%, flour's up 28%, milk 18%, a half gallon of ice cream 21%, chicken 20%. When you look at larger categories, this is what's happening to the American people. Since President Biden took office, all goods and many services in the wealthiest country in all of human history are up 17%. Food's up 20%, housing is up 17%, clothing is up 12%, used cars and trucks are up 25%, new cars and trucks are up 20%, and mortgage rates are up 174%. 174%. Now, some may be saying, well, but wages are going up too. Thank goodness. In some cases, wages have gone up. But the average wage of the average American has gone down after inflation. You don't look, the appropriate way to look at wage increases is not to look at the raw or the aggregate increase. It's looking at the increase after inflation. And if you take all of the average wage increases in the United States of America, and you look at the average inflation in the United States of America, workers have actually lost ground. Workers today, in November of 2023, are actually making less per hour after inflation than they were of February 2021. So don't let anybody tell you that wages have made up for this. They haven't kept up with inflation. And don't let anybody tell you, Mr. President, that we're winning the war on high prices. We are getting inflation down. No thanks to the Biden administration and, quite frankly, the United States Congress. That's thanks to the Federal Reserve. They have tightened interest rates, which has hurt a lot of people. But they have gotten inflation down. They've had to do it with one arm tied behind their backs, because the other way you attack inflation, and the only way we've ever successfully gotten down, is to have Congress do its part and reduce the rate of growth of spending and debt accumulation. But we haven't done that. We haven't done that. In fact, since 2019, the population of the United States of America is up 1.9%. Our country's grown 2% since 2019. You know how much our budget has grown? 55%. This inflation is man-made, and the man's name is Joe Biden. And we need to address it. So as we fight a hostile world, which day by day is becoming less safe for the American people, I don't want us to lose sight, Mr. President, of another problem, an equally important problem, that is stealing the American dream. and it's called President Biden's inflation. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.